Friends and viewers, A Passage to India by E.M.Forster. No doubt a remarkable English writer, E.M.Forster. A Passage to India is a very famous novel. So the story of this novel begins. Two Englishmen, the young Miss Adela, the young Miss Adela Quested and the elderly Mrs. Moore traveled to India. Adela's expect to become engaged to Mrs. Moore's son Ronnie, a British magistrate in the Indian city of Chandrapur. Adela and Mrs. Moore each hoped to see the real India during their visit rather than cultural institutions imported by the British. So at the same time, Aziz, another character, a young Muslim doctor in India, is increasingly frustrated by the poor treatment he received at the hand of English. Aziz is especially annoyed with Major Calendar, the civil surgeon who has a tendency to summon Aziz for a frivolous reason in the middle of dinner. Aziz and two of his educated friends, Hamidullah and Mahmood Ali, hold a lively conversation about whether or not an Indian can be friends with an Englishman in India. That night, Mrs. Moore and Aziz happens to run into each other while exploring a local mosque, and the two became friendly. Aziz is moved and surprised that an English person would treat him like a friend. Mr. Turton, the collector who governs Chandrapur, hosts a party so that Adela and Mrs. Moore may have the opportunity to meet some of the more prominent and wealthy Indians in the city. At that event, which proves to be rather awkward, Adela meets Cyril Fielding, the principal of the government college in Chandrapur. Fielding, impressed with Adela's open friendliness to the Indian, invites her and Mrs. Moore to tea with him and Hindu professor Godbole. At Adela's request, Fielding invites Aziz to tea as well. At the tea, Aziz and Fielding immediately became friendly, and the afternoon is overwhelmingly pleasant until Ronnie Heelslop arrives and rudely interrupts the party. Later that evening, Adela tells Ronnie that she has decided not to marry him, but that night the two are in car accident together, and the excitement of the event causes Adela to change her mind about the marriage. Not long afterward, Aziz organized an expedition to the nearby Marabar cave for those who attended Fielding tea. Fielding and Professor Godbole missed the train to Marabar, so Aziz continues on alone with the two ladies, Adela and Mrs. Moore, inside one of the caves. Mrs. Moore is unnerved by the enclosed space, which is crowded with Aziz's retinue, and by the uncanny that echo that seems to translate everywhere sound she makes into the noise boom. Aziz, Adela, and a guide go to the higher caves with Mrs. Moore waits below. Adela suddenly realizes that she does not love Ronnie. Asks Aziz whether he has more than one wife, a question he considered offensive. Aziz storms off into a cave. When he returns, Adela is gone. Aziz scolds the guide for losing Adela, and the guide runs away. Aziz finds Adela's broken field glasses and heads down the hill. Back at the picnic site, Aziz finds Fielding for him. Aziz is unconcerned to learn that Adela has hastily taken a car back to Chandrapur as he is overjoyed to see Fielding. Back in Chandrapur, however, Aziz is unexpectedly arrested. He is charged with attempting to rape Adila Questit while she was in the cave. A charge based on a claim Adila herself has made. Fielding, believing Aziz to be innocent, angers of all of the British India by joining the Indians in Aziz's defense. In the weeks before the trial, the racial tension between the Indians and English flare up considerably. Mrs. Moore is distracted and miserably because of her memory of the echo in the cave and because of her impatience with the upcoming trial. Adila is emotional and ill. She too seems to suffer from an echo in her mind. Ronnie is fed up with Mrs. Moore's lack of support for Adila's, and it is agreed that Mrs. Moore will return to England earlier than planned. Mrs. Moore dies on the voyage back to England, but not before she realizes that there is no real India, but rather a complex multitude of different Indians. At Aziz's trial, Adila under oath is questioned about what happened in the caves. Shockingly, she declares that she has made a mistake. Aziz is not the person or thing that attacked her in the cave. Aziz is set free and Fielding escort Adila to the government college, where she spent the next several weeks. Fielding begins to respect Adila, recognizing her bravery in standing against her peers to pronounce Aziz innocent. Ronnie breaks off his engagement to Adila and she returns to England. Aziz, however, is angry that Fielding would befriend Adila after she nearly ruined Aziz's life, and the friendship between the two men suffers as a consequence. Then Fielding sails for a visit to England. Aziz declared that he's done with English and that he intends to move to a place where he will not have to encounter them. 2 years later, Aziz has become the chief doctor of the Raja of Mau, a Hindu region several hundred miles from Chandrapur. He has heard that Fielding married Adila shortly after returning to England. Aziz now virulently hates all English people. One day, walking through an old temple with his 3 children, he encountered Fielding and his brother-in-law. Aziz is surprised to learn that the doctor brother-in-law's name is Ralph Moore. It turns out that Fielding married not Adila Questit, but Stella Moore, Mrs. Moore's daughter from her second marriage. Aziz befriends Ralph after he accidentally runs his rowboat into Fielding's. Aziz renews his friendship with Fielding as well. The two men go for a final ride together before Fielding leaves, during which Aziz tells Fielding that once the English are out of India, the two will be able to befriend. So what happened lastly that Fielding asks why they cannot befriend now when they both want to be, but the sky and the earth seems to say, no, not yet, no, not there. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of the novel, A Passage to India, written by E.M.Forster, a beautiful novel. And who are the characters? Let us discuss these characters briefly and shortly. Dr. Aziz, an intelligent, emotional Indian doctor in Chandrapur. Aziz attempts to make friends with Adila Questit, Mrs. Moore, and Cyril Fielding. Later, Adila falsely accuses Aziz of attempting rape after an expedition to the Marabar cave, but the charges are dropped after Adila's testimony at the trial. Cyril Fielding, the principal of Government College near Chandrapur. Fielding is an independent man who believes in educating the Indians to be individual, a much more sympathetic attitude toward the native population than the held by most English in India. Miss Adela Quisted, a young, intelligent, inquisitive, but somewhat repressed Englishwoman, Adela travels to India with Mrs. Moore in order to decide whether or not to marry Mrs. Moore's son Ronnie. Miss Quisted begins with an open-minded desire to get to know India and see the real India. Later, she falsely accuses Aziz of attempting rape. Mrs. Moore, an elderly English woman who voyaged to India with Adela Quisted. Mrs. Moore wishes to see the country and hopes that Adela will marry her son Ronnie. Mrs. Moore befriends Dr. Aziz as she feels some spiritual connection with him. She has an unsettling experience with bizarre echoes in the Marabar cave. Ronnie Heapstop, Mrs. Moore's son, the magistrate at Chandrapur, though well-educated and open-minded at heart, is become prejudiced and intolerant of Indian ever since he moved to India. Mr. Turton, the collector, the man who governs Chandrapur. Mr. Turton is officious and stern. Mrs. Turton, wife in her interaction with Indians. Mr. McBride, the superintendent of police in Chandrapur, who has an elaborate theory that he claims explains the inferiority of dark-skinned races to light-skinned ones. Major Calendar, a civil surgeon at Chandrapur. Dr. Aziz Superior. Professor Godbole, a Brahman Hindu who teaches at Fielding College. Godbole is very spiritual and reluctant to become involved in human affairs. Hamidullah, Dr. Aziz's uncle and friend. Mahmood Ali, lawyer friend of Dr. Aziz. Nawab Bahadur, a leading loyalist in Chandrapur. Dr. Panalal, a low-born Hindu doctor. Stila Moore, Mrs. Moore's daughter. Ralph Moore, Mrs. Moore's son. Miss Dirk, Amrit Rao, a lawyer. So these are the characters involved in this excellent novel, The Passage to India by E.M.Forster. So the themes is difficulty of English-Indian friendship involved, the unity of all living things, and the muddle of India, the negligence of British colonial government. These are the themes involved in this novel. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this is a very excellent novel written by E.M.Forster about the British colonial India of that time. I hope you will enjoy when you read it out. Thank you very much.